Okay, I'm Peter Osborne and I'm here in wonderful Fermanagh with Marion Maxwell. Marion, thank you very much indeed for taking part in this project, A Time for Change, and we're going to look at the period 1912 to 23, but with a few years either side. Marion, tell us a bit about yourself, your family, and your linkage to the Fermanagh area.
Okay, Fermanagh born and bred. I was born in Ballinalec in 1948. My father would be of, Ulster planter stock from Ayrshire from the early 1600s. He grew up in Monagh, very close to Monagh Castle. That would have been the sort of family, family documents go way back as tenants, right back to the early days of the plantation. Though interestingly, my great grandmother and my great great grandmother on my father's side were called Kelly. Now they were Church of Ireland, but I'm quite sure that if you were able to go far enough back, you would find that they hadn't always been Church of Ireland. And the Reverend Steele, in his Parish of Devonish book, has got a paragraph at the back where he mentions all the names which you would think of as planter names, which intermarried, and he made the point that there was a lot of intermarriage, which gets, people maybe think that's a kind of modern phenomenon, but it tends to get glossed over, and nobody kept any statistics, but I'm quite sure it happened quite a lot. So the idea of somebody being purely Irish or purely Ulster Scots or whatever, I don't buy that at all.
People just live their lives
Yeah,
regardless. And
yes. On my mother's side of the family, my grandparents met in Fermanagh, but my grandfather was from County Leitrim and my grandmother was from County Tipperary, from Templederry, and my grandfather was from outside Mohill. They met because he had joined the RIC and she was a teacher, and they both got sent to Fermanagh. My grandfather was born, his name was Thornton. They would also have been, they'd have come originally from England. They were on the Clements estate. He was one of a large family, and he actually ran away from home, we discovered, which absolutely astonished me because he was quite a stern, disciplinarian and all that, but he ran away from home, and the family were able to wire, when they found he was gone, his mother's family, who had a timber business in Dublin, and they got him off the boat and brought him home again.
what age was he when that happened?
I think he must have been about 13 or 14. Anyway, they had no, very few prospects. So joining the RIC was a very common route for people to get on. And the story was that he actually, so he became a recruit, and he was at home on holidays, and somebody was murdered in the area, and he managed to solve the murder by finding out, he reckoned that the man had been on his horse and that he had been hit with a whip in the back of the head, and he found the broken branch and found the bit. Anyway, he solved this thing. But it was all done incognito in the area because, there would have been sensitivities about all that sort of thing. Anyway, he acted as one of the bodyguards for Edward VII in one of his visits to Ireland. Never talked about it, but I think he got a medal. He would have been very, very discreet about talking about anything like that, but my imagination wonders, did he stand outside bedroom doors and all kinds of things, what stories he could have told. Anyway, you couldn't serve, he was in Kilrush in County Clare, and I think he was around when, I'll skip that bit because I can't remember who it was, somebody who was arrested there. Anyway, he he was a very keen cyclist, and the RIC had a cycling club. And so he was posted to Fermanagh. You couldn't serve in your home county. And meanwhile, my grandmother, her family were, that's my great grandfather there, Richard Markby. He was a farmer in Templederry. Again, a tenant farmer on the Otway estate. And he managed to send 4 of his daughters to Teacher Training College, Church of Ireland Teacher Training College in Kildare Street in Dublin. So my granny was one of them. And she, in those days, you had to go where you were sent, or you went to the bottom of the queue. So she was sent to teach in a little one-teacher national school called Corriglass. And he was in nearby Letterbreen, then he was in Arnie. Anyway, they struck up and they got married. They were married, I can't remember, was it? I'd have to look it up again. Was it 1908 or whatever? Anyway, they were going to go on honeymoon to visit the relatives in the south all around Tipperary. So they had to get a train. So they were married at 8 o'clock in the morning because there was no other transport available. There was one car in Fermanagh. And I'll have to find the date for you. And yeah, and he started a cycling club, not an RIC one. He started a cycling club, and I have the forms for it. And that would have been, you know, up to the First World War. I have the booklet they had issued to the membership, and he clearly based the rules on the RIC cycling club rules, because, you know, they had they're supposed to have a bugler, and, you know, and my grandfather had written in handwriting, you know, you are not allowed to enter any public establishment, public house, you know, so, but my grandmother would have had to leave that because there were no female members, as far as I know, at that time. But they thought nothing at that time of cycling to Bundoran. That was just an outing, cycling to Bundoran and back. So my grandfather was stationed in Arnie, and that's where my grandmother was born. My mother was born, and she had an older brother and a younger brother and a sister. So they were in temporary accommodation while he was in Arnie, and then they lived in a wee house down a bog somewhere. While meantime, my grandfather had made great friends with a man called Brady, who lived up at the Curragh, near. Oh, it's on the way to Belcoo, near Loch McNean, and they used to go shooting together. And he actually bought. You weren't allowed officially to buy a farm, but his friend bought the farm in his name, and no paperwork, nothing went down on paper. But my grandfather trusted him that he would pass on the farm to him when he retired, which he did. From the RIC, he retired at partition, and so while they were waiting an old lady lived in the house of the farm at Derryhowla, and they had to wait till she had her day in it, and they lived in this wee house in the bog. And I mean, my mother remembers a brother of my grandfather's came up from Mohill to live. There was quite a movement across the border to the north around that time, and my mother remembers them knocking on the window in the middle of the night, having come up from Mohill. Anyway, it was strange times. My grandfather was obviously in the midst of all the tensions that were going on, the political tensions all around that time. He had to take different routes cycling home. I think he was maybe stationed in Enniskillen for a while, and there was one story, again, he never talked about it, but he talked to his older son in his latter years, and he was cycling home one night, and he heard this voice from the ditch, and the voice said, hurry up, go on, or go by another route, or whatever it was. It was somebody was warning him that he could get shot, and he reckoned that that person saved his life. And it would have been a local person who didn't approve of whatever else was going on. So that brings me to a theme which is kind of dear to my heart. I think human beings are essentially the same, and given certain circumstances will react in similar ways. People who have felt oppressed, when they get power, very often become the oppressors, that kind of thing. Also, in every group, there are people who have more scruples and people who have fewer scruples in every group in society. And I do think, and I've imbibed this from my parents as well, and going back to further generations. Carlo Gabler wrote a book, oh, maybe I shouldn't mention it. Anyway, the term has been used, the glass curtain, about relations and this was written about Fermanagh, and I don't believe that it was anything, there is anything as solid as glass. I think particularly in rural communities, the subtleties of the interrelationships between people is, the subtleties are infinite, because people are very complex as well. And you might have a good relationship with your farming neighbour and help each other out. You might have different political views, but in some way that relationship might colour a decision, what you might be in favour of or what you mightn't be in favour of. It's infinitely subtle, the relationships. So I don't know, I'm rambling now.
Let me go back to nobody's going to be listening to what I say, so I can,
okay. Yeah.
we can ramble, both of us. But there's a whole lot there of what you've just introduced, which is terrific. And can I go back to just two or three of them? And I'm gonna stick maybe first of all with your grandfather from the RIC.
Yes.
And there's two or three things there which are really, really interesting. So he joined the he was the guy that tried to
run away
when he was 12 or 13.
Yeah.
Why would he have done that, first of all, do you
Well,
think?
he had, he could see there were no prospects. He wasn't going to inherit a farm. I think it was a small holding anyway. And he probably had a sense of adventure, and, he could have, if he'd got to London or whatever, he could have made good in any field, So he just, but how do we know? He might have had a row with his father. We'll never know. Yeah, there could be all of that.
But he certainly had enough about him to get on to
To
the
get,
boat.
yeah.
He was doing it. It
That's
wasn't
right.
a false running away.
Oh no, he did.
He was doing
Yeah.
it okay.
Yeah.
It's really interesting. So he then joined the RIC.
Yeah.
And he's brought up in what we now know as the South.
Yeah.
And as you say, if you're in the RIC, you get sent elsewhere.
Yes.
And he gets sent up to Fermanagh, and so the family's still here after that move, I suppose.
Yes.
How do you think he would have felt about that at the time, coming to the north? Although it wouldn't have been.
Well, it was pre-partition. Well, Fermanagh would have been a slightly more prosperous place than where he grew up, and politically it would have had a slightly different complexion. I mean, where he grew up would have been fairly, strongly Republican area, Although he lived, I think, he had a cousin lived on the Derry Carn estate. They would have, but I mean, my grandfather's father or grandfather, the landlord was the infamous Lord Leitrim, who was later murdered in Donegal. And I mean, he made him, he ploughed a field without getting permission, and he made him turn every sod back again. But he was particularly renowned as being a very, very stern, tough landlord. So he would have seen it, and I suppose when you're in the RIC, when you're in an organisation, you're a bit in a bubble anyway. But no, he would have seen it, well, I suppose, as progress. But he played the melodeon, and he loved music. He loved Irish dancing. He played handball. You occasionally see an old handball court. And I think the majority of RIC members were Catholic. But there's a kind of old style politics, because he went on to become a councillor, and he was very stern in his loyalty and all this sort of stuff. But there was I remember hearing that, Charlie McKeown was, he was a nationalist councillor in Enniskillen, and they would have these council meetings, and they would thrash it all out, along party lines, but they would go to McGee's and have a drink together afterwards. Now, you can view that in one of two ways. You could say, well, flip me, they weren't setting a very good example in public. But it kind of points as well to this kind of subtlety that there is in people's interactions, which get completely lost in headlines, particularly nowadays. You only hear the extremes, but I also think that because of the Troubles, particularly, which arose for very valid reasons, but the violence and the killing and everything, I think, and we got sucked into an urban phenomenon as well, and I think that it made things a lot more bitter.
Well, it's interesting because I assume your grandfather's became a councillor after he retired from the police.
Oh, yes, yes.
And so we're talking maybe about the 1920s when he was going for drinks with other folk
Yeah,
from
yeah,
the council.
yeah.
And that's, of course, after a period of troubles.
Yes, it would have been maybe even into the 30s,
Right.
Yeah, But again, I'm jumping about a bit here, but talking about, knowing who you can trust, he would have had to be very careful, obviously, because of being in the RIC. But he had somebody who helped on the farm, and he would have trusted his life on him. He would have been from a Catholic background, and that man's daughters came and helped work on the farm, and my mother learnt to do jigs and reels, holding on to the stake in the byre, where the girls would have taught them, Irish dancing. Now, you can be a bit rosy-eyed about all this kind of thing, but nevertheless, I do think there are those subtleties, and that in no matter what situation, I went to Trinity College in Dublin, and many years later I was invited to be present when Nelson Mandela spoke. I mean, he was an old man by then, but so impressive. And one thing stuck out in my mind. He said, no matter what group of people you are dealing with, always remember there are some good people in it. And I think it's a very useful thought to hold on to.
Let's come back to that in a wee bit as well.
Yeah.
Because my sense, Marion, would be your grandfather would be very proud of you saying and doing some of the things that you've said and done over the years as well.
Well,
but here's just carrying his story on briefly before we go into one or two.
Well, he was a kind of an unconstructed unionist, mind you, though. But anyway.
Well, different folk in different eras.
Yeah. Yes.
So he came up, he was in the RIC. You said he solved a murder. He was a bodyguard for Edward VII.
Yes,
Presumably
yeah.
when Edward VII came to this part of the world.
Oh no, it was in Dublin
Oh,
while
in
he
Dublin.
was training in Dublin,
Okay.
and he was also in a party where they had to stand when I don't know whether, again I have to get my dates, whether he was still the prince or whether he was the king at that time, but the family say that that's where my grandmother would have first seen him, because she was a student in Kildare Street Training College and they went to see the king coming, or the prince, it must have been the king, and so she must have seen him. They say that in retrospect.
So your grandmother saw her future husband.
Yes.
Looking probably very impressive.
Yes, in the
guarding
uniform.
king.
Yeah, and she said, one thing my mother told me that she did say that they used to walk from Arney when he was stationed in Arney. They used to walk to the church in Benelek, and he would have his firearm, whatever it was at the time, but you never wore it in church, so he would have taken that off when he went in. But she did say that my grandmother said that there were, there were people who spat on them, so there would have been all different complexions of thoughts.
And this would still have been pre-partition, presumably.
Oh, very much so. Yes. Yeah.
And would that?
But that wouldn't have been everyone,
Would that have been because he was in the police, or
Yes.
would that have been because of?
Oh, because he was in the police. Yeah.
Okay. Wouldn't have been about background or anything. It would have just been.
No. Oh no. Yeah.
He also seems to be a character who you say played handball, was very fond of singing and dancing, played music and so on. So he loved life. He was in the police, and then at some point, I'm going to maybe assume after the First World War, with the
He got
troubles that
involved
were-
in local politics.
Well, I'm thinking
Sorry.
about when he was cycling home, taking different routes. So there was a reason he was taking different routes, and I assume that's maybe because of the troubles that were going on 1918 to 21.
Well, I'll have to again
And then he
sort
was
out the
warned by
dates in my
somebody.
head. Yeah.
So leaving aside the dates, so
Yes,
I don't
okay.
really mind about the dates so
Okay,
much. But
yeah.
that says to me a bit it's around that time, because there's troubles going
Yes,
on,
yeah.
different routes being
Yes.
taken, personal security concerns.
Yes.
And then somebody from a ditch shouts at him and says, basically, go somewhere else, go a
Yes.
different route.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, what would your grandfather's reaction have been? Did he go a different route? And why would somebody have warned him?
Because, as I say, there were different complexions. Well, you know that there were different factions within nationalism at that time. There would have been the Sinn Féin, the rise of Sinn Féin, but there would have been the AOH, the Ancient Order of Hibernians. And to give you an example of the tensions within that, there was a band, a flute band in a townland called Ballymonone, or a group of townlands which is very close to here. And I know about this because, first of all, Henry Glassy, I don't know if you've heard of him, but he did a study of passing the time in Ballymonone for people there. It appears in that, but I also did research in the local newspapers. And the band was called the A.M. Sullivan Flute Band. Now, A.M. Sullivan wrote the definitive Irish history book, which was used for generations, even, after partition and everything. And I mean, it's just unreconstructed 400 years of oppression, Ireland's glory, and, just, sort of blow by blow account, But that was used in schools, and that's what people were taught. I feel very strongly about that. I mean, the teaching of history here in the north is another story, which was equally bad. But that's what people learned. That's what they were taught. So the band was called the A.M. Sullivan Flute Band, and there was a flute band an orange flute band in Ballinalek, and there were flute bands all over the place because there were, you know, cheap instruments and all that. But there was a big row. There was going to be a Sinn Féin rally in Enniskillen, and within the same community there, some people had joined the Sinn Féin group, and they wanted the band to go to a rally in Enniskillen. So some of the band members hid the instruments. They kind of took the instruments and hid them so the band couldn't go. And there was they took each other to law, and it's all reported in the local papers about who, and was this a formally constituted band, and where did they meet, and where did they have, and one meeting was they had the meeting at the bottom of somebody's lane, you know, and it actually became, do you know, it became a case in law because the person who finally made the decision on that was Edward Carson.
Really?
And it's cited in some law things. Anyway, so curious. But anyway, so that's an example of the tensions there were within the nationalist population, you know.
Or instruments were being hidden. So they didn't
yes.
take part in something.
Yeah, and one lot would have been more militant, and the other lot weren't, you know.
And with bands all over, in some ways things haven't changed.
Yeah, but then the other side of the story is my father would say, you know, that they did lend each other instruments, you know. Now, you can be too fairy-eyed, you know, and think, you know, oh gosh, it was all great, you know, but I just keep coming back to the point that there are infinite subtleties in the way people interacted, you know, and that all gets swept aside in written history and in headlines and all that sort of thing.
Well, the fact that it wasn't all great is evidenced by your father being warned in the ditch by
my
somebody.
grandfather,
Your grandfather, sorry.
Yeah.
And it strikes me that the person in the ditch who warned your grandfather not to go any further, first of all, knew him. So these were local personalities who knew each other.
Yes.
And maybe secondly, warned him because he maybe liked your grandfather or had a relationship with him.
Or maybe done him a good turn, or who knows what. Yeah. That's what I mean, you know.
It's absolutely fine. Do you know what happened on that night, or did anything?
Oh, well, then nothing happened. So he reckons that whoever it was, you know, tipped him off and saved his life.
Right.
Yeah.
So actually, it was somebody targeting him, possibly somebody further down the road.
Oh yes, yeah, targeting my grandfather.
Yeah.
Or he knew that it was likely that was going to happen. Yeah.
That must have been an incredibly difficult thing for both your grandfather and your grandmother to live through, taking the gun even to church, even though not into the church, and altering the routes and getting hassled.
Well, yeah, I mean, yes, I'm sure it was, but they just, I don't know, just got on with their lives.
One of the other things, which is moving on from that, and we'll come back to your grandfather if you want to. There's somebody else in your family that you were saying sent his 4 daughters to school.
Richard Markby.
Richard Markby. Let's say his name. And was he one of your other grandfathers?
He is my mother's grandfather. He was my great grandfather.
Your maternal.
It's like something out of Thomas Hardy, isn't it?
Yeah. And for people who can't see it, yes, it's an old black and white photograph, and he's leaning on a.
But his ancestors came from Lincolnshire.
Right.
Now we knew that because of the Markby name, but there was further proof because Joseph Markby, who was the first one to come from Lincolnshire to County Tipperary, appears in the transportation lists.
Okay.
He was transported to Van Diemen's Land for 7 years in 1823.
Wow.
And this was never talked about. I mean, the family went on and they became very respectable, hard-working pillars of the Church of Ireland. You know, like my grandfather would have gone to the Synod in Dublin and all that sort of thing. And we have the records from the Sunday schools and all that sort of stuff. And they sent the 4 girls to the Church of Ireland Teacher Training College. But this Joseph, who would have been maybe his grandfather, it wasn't talked about. But he, as far as I can see, he was illegally in a house overnight. Now, I thought at first, was he chasing women or something? But then there's something about something to do with land agitation or something. I don't know. I have to get to the bottom of it. But anyway, he was transported. He went and he did his 7 years. He went to Australia, to New South Wales, and committed bigamy because his widow, Markby, the poor widow Markby, we'd always felt so sorry for, she was still alive in Ireland. So, and her maiden name was Dag. Now, I did my DNA and I thought, without thinking too much about it, I thought I'd be solidly Ulster Scots, but I'm more English than anything. Although, of course, that again, DNA tests just show up the complete fallacy of this idea of being pure anything, even pure Celtic. There's no such thing. But I realised that both my maternal grandparents were both of English stock,
Well,
Thornton and Markby.
Well, it does show that we're from all over the place, aren't we? But I'm just minded that he sent his 4 girls to teacher training college, which in an era when for women that probably was unusual.
Yes.
And when obviously women's rights and so on were
Yeah.
not very well developed.
Yeah.
So was it saying something about him and his
Yes,
attitude?
he was a very enlightened man himself. I mean, he wouldn't have had formal education, but he...
And just say his name again. This is
Richard Markby.
Richard Markby, your maternal grandfather.
Yes, my maternal great-grandfather. Yeah. I think he was a very enlightened man. I think he was very thrifty, apparently, but very hard-working. He saw the value of education. Now, that's why he was so keen. He had one son and he inherited the farm. But the 4 of the daughters... Oh, he had another son. Joe, who went to Chicago. And he was in love with some girl before he went. And the girl ditched him. He discovered that when he came home, so he went back to Chicago and he married across the religious divide. So I have Markby relatives, the only Markby relatives I'm in touch with, live in Chicago. And I met one of them not that long ago, was over with his daughter taking part in the Irish Dancing World Championships in Belfast. And they grew up very near to where Michael Flatley lived.
Wow. And that's really interesting because there's a family with Irish roots from 100 years ago.
Yeah.
And they still have very strong Irish
feel
about them.
Yeah. So...
what happened to the 4 daughters?
Right. They're all buried in Ballinalek.
Right.
My grandmother came here as a teacher and she continued to teach even when she was married. Her sister... Matilda, Auntie Till. My grandmother was Ellen or Nell Markby. Her sister Matilda, she was younger, and she went and finished. Right, sorry. Can I start that again? I made a pig knickers. First of all, I think there were only 3 of them were teachers. The others married farmers. There was Auntie Blenner, and there was my grandmother, and there was Auntie Till. I think there were just the 3 of them. But Auntie Blenner's children went on to be teachers. Anyway, so the eldest girl was Sarah Markby, and she got a teaching job in Ballymackelligot in County Kerry, and married a sort of a junior branch of the Blennerhassett family. And he wasn't, I think they were associated with Ballyseedy Castle. But I don't think he had an awful lot of money, but he would have had the airs of a gentleman, and he They had greyhounds and all. I don't think he did a huge amount of work. But my grandmother was a teacher, and she reared a big family, and at least 3 of the girls became teachers. The 2 sons joined the Air Force. Dick, the older one, went on to fly Churchill. He became one of his pilots of choice because he had flown him through. I have a picture of the 2 of them, those 2 boys there. He flew him through a storm, and Churchill asked who was. So I think he flew him to one of the big conferences in Yalta or somewhere. But anyway, the other one was shot down, Joe. The day he was shot dead, the day his plane was shot down, he appeared to his parents in the hayfield, so they say. Anyway, his body was never recovered. He didn't know, but his new wife was newly pregnant. And I'm in touch with Joe's grandson. And that's another big long story. So anyway, so Auntie Blenner taught in Ballymackelligot, and they all left, and of course it became changed times for a family like that in the south. And in her retirement she came up to a little house that my father sorted out for in Belnalek, and she's buried very close to where her sister, my grandmother. And then my another sister, Auntie Till, she was very excitable, but she was kind of she was very, very clever. But they say that she was in love with a young man who joined the Indian Army, and her father wouldn't let her go because he thought she couldn't stick the climate. She was sent down to school. Auntie Blenner kind of took her under her wing. She finished her schooling there, went to teacher training college in Kildare Street, and then got a job up near her sister here, and that was in Drominiskell School. So anyway, the 3 Markby sisters are buried very close, side by side, in the local graveyard here. But it's one of the things I love about graveyards, all the stories that you don't know, because they have 3 different names. Nobody would suspect that they were sisters, because one became Thornton, one became Armstrong, and one became Blennerhassett. So
that's lovely in so many ways, not just their own personal stories, but you know, and maybe this is too simplistic a way of looking at it. I'm thinking of their father and mother trying to empower them as women.
Yes.
And,
oh yeah.
and push them on to do other things that most women in those days wouldn't have been empowered to do.
Yes.
But always being held back a little bit, maybe by other
relationships
relationships in their life.
Yes. Well, another thing, my Auntie Blenner, I remember her in her old age, and she was a beautiful woman. She was a lovely woman, and she was very soft spoken and gentle. But she was a terrific reader, I would say. She was a very cultured person, and you know, and I'm saying that for a reason, because my grandmother, I think, was a real workaholic. And so was my grandfather, and we can never understand how between them, and my grandmother was a teacher, and she put other people on for teacher training, but none of her 4 children went for further education, not one of them. The oldest boy, well, he lost an eye in a cataract accident. He wanted to join the army because his eye said he couldn't get in, but my grandfather's whole idea was get them set up with farms, with land. That to him, from his background, I think, meant security. And he was a man of action. He wasn't a book person. Whereas Auntie Blenner, she had a real love of learning. She loved Anthony Trollope. She read all those classics, and her house was full of books. So there's, you know, a difference within. And I mean, who knows whether my grandfather was influenced that way because of his background, or whether he would have been like that. I mean, you know, in anybody's personality, all sorts of factors feed in. But my mother taught my grandmother, you know, cycled to school, cycled home again, went and fed the calves, kept the, you know, poultry and all the rest on the farm, and kept the 2 daughters at home. until they got married. And my mother, who, I mean, they were all, I can say it, they were all really, really clever. But my mother, she met my father and got married. And her younger sister, I know her daughter was quite bitter that the parents kept her at home, you know, longer than they should have done. And you know, they wouldn't let her get married for quite a few years. But they were walking with brains. And then probably the cleverest of them all was the younger brother, the second son. And because the older brother didn't go on into the army or whatever, they kept him at home, and the grandfather supplied a farm for him. And he should have been an engineer. You know, he was walking with brains. He was brilliant. But he never should have been a farmer, and he had a drink problem and all sorts of things, and raised a family and all that. But he just did not belong where he ended up.
Square peg in a round hole.
Yes. So going back a couple of generations, it does make sense of things too.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I want to ask you as well. You touched on, and this is in this whole period where you're talking about with your grandparents and with aunts and so on, great grandparents, where there was a lot of movement across the border to the north. I'm assuming that's going back into that period of 1918 to 21-22 when partition happened, and that's
and then in the years immediately after partition as well.
Tell us a bit more about that, those years prior and after, and what you wouldn't obviously remember it, but your parents or grandparents may have.
Well, you see, it impacted hugely on my mother's side of the family. My father's side of the family, they farmed in Cullen and Scandley, and those townlands, going right back generations. So it didn't impact on them so much. I mean, my father's father was a councillor as well, and he was on the Board of Guardians. So it had much more of an effect on the other side of the family. Because of my grandfather been in the RIC, also the area they came from, and the fact that they moved north, so they were in the forefront of any tensions or changes that would have been going on there. Mm-hmm.
Would it have been family members that would have been moving north then, that when you referred to?
Well, it was notably my grandfather and his brother.
Right.
His brother.
And they were the people that knocked the window,
yes,
the door in the middle of the night?
Yes, they come up to see where this place was that they were buying.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. And again, I think he had married a woman, and I think her family had a wee bit of money and they helped them to buy this farm. But it was all, a big adventure for them coming from County Leitrim, and people didn't travel in those days very far. So they came up to sort of suss out where it was they were coming to.
Okay. I think it's great. I want to ask you one other thing, and then I also want to ask you about this island from what you were saying at the start. And forgive me for not remembering exactly who this was. But you talked about a couple that got married at 8 o'clock in the morning, and they had to do that because the only train was. Tell us a bit. Again,
that was my grandparents. William Abraham Thornton, Willie Thornton, and Ellen Markby. They got married at 8 o'clock in the morning because they were, for their kind of honeymoon, they were going round the relatives in the south, as people often did. If they didn't go to Bundoran, they went to the relatives in the south. And they had to get married at 8 o'clock in the morning because there was only one car available. I don't know if they got that car, but anyway, the thing was they had to catch a train to go south. So that was why they got married at 8 o'clock in the morning.
And where, do you know where they got married?
Yes, in, God, my head's gone. What do you call it? It's now combined with Benelect Church. It's outside Belcoo. What the heck do you call the church? Oh, it's gone out of my head. I'll remember.
But it was local, and so there was only one car to take them to the train station in Enniskillen.
Yes, and they wouldn't have had a lot of relatives at the wedding because all my grandmother's family were in Tipperary, and my grandfather's family were in Leitrim. So, you know.
When you go to weddings these days, everything is laid on. You have
For goodness sake,
cars,
helicopters,
and helicopters and everything else. And
yeah,
there you have something.
Mullaghdown Church. Mullaghdown Church is where they got married.
Generations ago, people were getting married at 8 a.m.
Oh, aye, absolutely,
to,
absolutely, yeah.
To get the train.
Yes.
I think it was brilliant. Marion, tell us about the because we're talking about some of your relatives. Oh, sorry. Tell us first about one of your relatives in particular. I think was it a chap called Gunning.
Yes.
Who fought in Gallipoli.
It was not my relatives, that's my husband's.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, John's mother was
Started
Kathleen.
off and tell us who he was.
Okay, well, my husband, John Maxwell, his mother was Kathleen Gunning, and she married Billy Maxwell, who was a chemist in Enniskillen. Anyway, her 4 brothers all joined up in the First World War. The youngest one was too young. He joined the sort of cadet part of the Navy. And Jack, the oldest one, went into the Navy. And the 2 middle ones, Cecil and Douglas, joined the Dublin Fusiliers, the Pals Brigade, who formed up on the rugby ground in Lansdowne Road. Now, they would have been a more prosperous family than my background, because their father was the actuary, Sinclair Gunning was the actuary of the Savings Bank in Enniskillen, and they lived at that time in Willoughby Place, and Sinclair had married Kathleen Benson, whose father was originally from Letterbreen, but he had come up through his career in the post office in London and came back as postmaster to Enniskillen. But the Gunning brothers, they'd all gone to Pretoria, they played rugby. There was a big tradition of them going into the bank. All 4 of them went into the bank. The oldest brother, Jack, ended up as the head of the, which is the Merchant Hotel now in Enniskillen. They lived in that house. That was their house, the bank headquarters. Anyway, Cecil and Douglas joined the Dublin Fusiliers and went out to Gallipoli. Kept a diary. The local museum has a copy of the diary, a photocopy of it. It's very, very interesting. I'll not tell you all about that at the minute, but it was, idyllic going out on the ship, and there was a canvas swimming pool on board, and died and stopping in Alexandra and buying oranges and all this. I mean, they had no idea what they were going to. Then they landed on the beach and met some of the people they recognised from Enniskillen who were with the Enniskillings there. Anyway, it was pretty horrific, and Cecil, Douglas was invalided home first on a hospital ship. It was disease and dysentery that got a lot of them. And Cecil, it was eventually invalided home as well via Egypt. But Douglas came home to recuperate, and there's this strong feeling of arriving home. They felt very strongly that they were Irish, and coming home to Dublin was a huge thing for them. And he made his way back to Enniskillen, but he was having nightmares and all kinds of things. He was traumatised, but he enlisted again with the Enniskillings and went out to France. And the last entries, at first he was sort of trying to reassure the mother that he was managing okay, but the last message home was all about the deafening roar and how terrible it was, really. But anyway, he was killed. He had a finger shot off first, and he went to a dressing station, and he could have gone back. He would have every reason, with a blighty, to go home, but he insisted on staying with his men, went over the top, and his body was never found. There was nothing to bury. So that was a big trauma in that family, and then John's mother was the youngest. She was the only girl, you know, and their father died just before Douglas was killed, so he never knew. So the mother was left, and the other boy still in the war. So anyway,
it's hard to imagine now what would have been a young man,
yeah,
being put into an environment which is just so horrible as he
Oh,
was
yeah,
in both
yeah.
Gallipoli, and
Yeah,
then
yeah.
volunteering to go back
That's right.
to France.
That's right. That's right.
And then volunteering to go back into the trenches when he could have
Yeah,
gone home.
yeah.
I mean, that takes
Yeah,
a
yeah.
particular
Oh,
courage.
Absolutely.
But it's
Yeah.
hard to imagine just
Yeah.
what would have been going through his
Oh
mind.
yes, absolutely. Yeah, one of thousands and thousands.
And of course, this was happening while your grandparents were in the area
Here, having a
coping
very
with some of
different.
the politics.
yeah.
that-
Can I take just a wee?
Please, of course.
I want to check John's blood sugar
Do.
because
Do you mind if I
there was
do?
a question mark over whether he injected this morning. I don't think he did, but he thinks he did. Can I make you fresh coffee?
Not at all. No,
Really?
no, I'm absolutely
Are you sure?
fine. Thank you.
I don't really know. Somebody came. Somebody found letters that were written by a policeman who was stationed in Arnie Barracks, and it must have been the same time as my grandfather was there, and he mentions that Thornton and I took somebody to the asylum today, and it seemed so stark, you know, and people had no bother using that word.
Yeah.
But changed times.
It also shows just the variety of things I think police officers just get up to. Still do, I suppose.
Yeah.
But we don't say that.
Yeah.
That's the word anymore.
Yeah.
Anyway, Marion, it's not necessarily to do with your family, but and just for the sake of anybody
I'm going to
listening-
have some more of this.
Oh, if it's warm, I'll certainly take some more. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. That's great. Thank you.
Nothing like a fix a caffeine drink.
Oh, it is warm.
You know.
What was I saying there? It's not,
About the island?
Not with your family,
Yeah.
but both your wider family, including your husband's as well as your own family. You've been talking about some memories from that 1913 to 1912 to 1923 period, including the First World War. And for the sake of people who aren't able to see, we're overlooking a little bit of Lough Erne, and there's an island just beyond us, is there? Tell us a story about the island and its relevance to the First World War.
Okay, well, we're just downstream from Cleanish Island, the sloping island, and it would have been most widely known because of there having been a monastery as one of the important monastic sites on Lough Erne. And Columbanus spent his formative years there before he went on to Bangor and then ultimately to the continent. But as a local history group here, we did a project looking at the resettlement of 11 ex-servicemen on the island after the First World War. And so that was a whole completely different chapter in the history of the island. When the final push was on, they were desperate for recruits, and Lord French, specifically in Ireland, promised men that they would get a bit of land if they came home from the war as an incentive to join up. Anyway, this a whole scheme was rolled out in Ireland. Now this was separate from the English scheme, and the scheme in Ireland was administered jointly between London and Dublin and Belfast. It was a sort of an early example of cross-border community. Anyway, you don't want all that. You don't want all that legal background. Anyway, the point is that the island was owned by a Captain Collum, who lived just not far down the lake at Bellevue, and there was great difficulty finding suitable land, but because it was an island, most of it was untenanted, and it had to be untenanted land. So he sold 3/4 of the island to the Land Commission. They divided it into 11 holdings of between 29 and 45 acres, shall we say, and substantial stone house was built on each holding, on 11 of them, 9 of them, and then they repurposed 2 houses for the other 2. And men were chosen from a list of applicants. There was a point system, you know, your service, your injuries, whether you had farming background. Anyway, the 11 people who were chosen to be allocated these farms, apart from 2 of them, they were from Fermanagh, and the others were from just across the border, one from the Black Lion area, one from County Cavan. And the farms were legally signed over to them, but they had to pay an annuity. In other words, they had to find a certain amount of cash twice a year. It was a bit like a mortgage system. The land was excellent, really good, fattening land. They were given a small amount of money towards buying stock. But to cut a long story short, the scheme did not work out. It was a bit of a disaster because there was no bridge onto the island, and the man who built the houses charged a premium to the Land Commission because of the location of the building, and as a result the rents or the annuities were set very high. It was like £1 an acre, which was a lot of money in those days. So they could feed themselves, but they had to find cash to pay the annuities, which meant they had to sell something. It was a mission. There was an old cot to get milk over on the cot and then to the nearest creamery. It was in Ballinalek. The nearest shop was in Ballinalek. So they had a lot of physical hardship through being on the island, and also they suffered some disasters, like the cattle took liver fluke and most of them died. It was a real struggle for them to be able to replace their stock. They couldn't get stuff to market, etc. Within 10 years, half of them were gone. And we have all the documentation, the Public Records Office, a petition signed by all of them in 1926, and we reckon that they were there in 1922, say. So a few years in, they were in real difficulties. They wanted a bridge built. My father always said if they had built the bridge at the very start, before they built the houses, everything would have been, you know, would have made up for the expense of building the bridge, and they could have had easy access to everything: schools, creamery, bog, because there was no turf on the island. Everything was a hardship to them, but they were in a long process of trying to communicate with Stormont and not getting anywhere very well. And one of the telegrams that was sent was, "We're marooned on the island," because in some weather the float or the cot couldn't cross, and it was very dangerous. And I remember Fred Turnan, who, you know, was steeped in life on the lake and boating and everything. He said if they had the way people survived on islands in Lough Erne, they knew how to fish, they could do a bit of farming, and they were boating people. But that just wasn't taken into account when these men were settled on the island. They originally had a site on the mainland in Ballinalek, but that fell through. So it was really it wasn't thought out.
And presumably the premium on the houses was because it was very difficult to get the stone over to the island.
Well,
to build the houses,
yes,
to start with.
But as it happened, the man who got the contract was the only one who tendered, and he was very experienced. He'd done building in Enniskillen. What he did was he quarried the stone on the island.
Oh, really?
And saved himself a lot of money. So he had his head screwed on.
But still charged the premium.
Still charged the premium. So anyway, it's made for sad reading. And the other thing, that we discovered when we delved into the whole story was that they all brought the war back with them. I don't think there was any of them who were, I'd safely say there were none of them who were unscathed. One of them attempted suicide. He came on his own to the island and he attempted suicide a short time after. He attempted to cut his throat, but he survived. And he ended up being brought to what at that time was called the asylum in Omagh. He came out under the care of his brothers, but he was never able to come back to live on the island. There was another one who suffered terrible frostbite. He used to have to walk on his heels. His sister came to the island with him. He had been the life and soul of the party before he joined up. He sang at concerts in Fermanagh camp when they were, when they were training before they went out to France. When he came back, he was a recluse. He planted beautiful, the snowdrops still come up around where his house was, and he planted trees and the inspector said that he had made the best stab at making something of his holding, but they had to leave in the end, and in the end, after they'd come to live in the mainland in the early 1950s, he ultimately took his own life. There was another man who would have been from a more well-to-do family. He'd lost the power of one arm. When he applied, he was in a rehab hospital in London, so he couldn't row a boat over to the island and back. So he eventually left, but the other thing was you couldn't just leave, you had to pay a forfeit because they had invested a certain amount of money in you. So there were to's and fro's and legalities to do with that. Nothing was easy, nothing was simple. The only one of them who managed to stay on the island lived to be almost 100. And the reason he survived was he had been born on the townland on the other shore. He was familiar with the area. He knew how to handle a boat. He was very tough. He was from a farming background. Most of them were farm labouring background where they had no prospect of inheriting land. So this would have been seen and was a terrific opportunity for them if the conditions had been right and if they hadn't been traumatised. But Johnny Balfour, who lived on, and I have a recording of him.
Marion!
Hello?
Where are you?
I'm here, pet.
I'm going for a snooze.
That's grand. Okay, see you shortly.
There's a letter for you here.
Yeah, that's okay, I'll get it shortly. He got a job as a caretaker of the old graveyard at the monastic site. He got a job, he got paid something for ferrying the children over to the mainland to go to school. Even then they would have had to walk out to the road to get a bus, and the bus was a horse-drawn wagon, by the way, at that time. Another man got paid for bringing the milk to the creamery or over to be collected. Anyway, Johnny managed to hold on, and my father had the local shop, and there was one time Johnny called in with him and he said, I'm on my way into town with the deeds of the place in my pocket. He was just ready to give up, but he had a litter of pigs and he managed to sell them for a decent price, and it was as close as that he was able to hold on. And he reared a family who were all really hard working. And he was the only one, and he stayed on, and he brought 3 of his daughters, I think, across on the ferry to get married in Benelec. And the youngest one, he was able to drive, they drove across the bridge. It was a bridge finally built in 1952 or 1953. And he did an interview with Helen, what was her name? I have it, a copy, and we've got it digitised, where he talked about the war. He refused to talk about the war. Helen Madden, I don't know if you remember Helen Madden.
I do, yeah.
And she got him to talk about it. He refused at first, but he did, and he said the devil couldn't throw anything at you like we experienced. And, you know, and he talked about, you know, walking over dead people. He just, you know, but he wouldn't talk about it to the family either, which was typical. Yeah. They didn't talk about it. So, and saying to you earlier, when he was on his deathbed in his 100th year, his old shrapnel wounds opened up as his body broke down, which was pretty amazing. He was invalided home at one point, and I have a photograph of him standing with he had a walking stick, and his brother taken in a studio and in a skilling. So he made it home, you know. I don't know if you want or interested, but two of the other veterans who came to the island, I think it was coincidental that they ended up together on this scheme, but one of them had saved the other one's life. They hadn't known each other before the war, but one of them had saved the other person's life in France. And yeah, and they remained friends for life.
I'm sure they did.
Yeah. So when we went to do the project, we initially met with a little bit of resistance because of events since. Because in the case of one, possibly maybe a couple of the families, there was resistance to being involved or getting involved or coming forward about anything to do with having been in the British Army. Okay. But it worked out great in the end, you know.
So the men on the island would have been from across...
They exactly mirrored the population at the time, kind of 60-40. Okay. The criteria for applying, religion wasn't mentioned. Okay. There was absolutely no mention of religion. Okay. So and that's the way it worked out. Yes, that's right. And we had a community event on the island, and Nick van der Marlier, who was the representative of Flanders to the British government in London, he came over and he brought a bag of soil from Messine Ridge. Wow. And we planted a commemorative oak tree. So we were through all that, you know, and it was...
That's wonderful.
It was an experience. So, but the houses are all there, but they are going into decay. But the interesting thing is, nobody has actually knocked them down, and they're fattening farms. Characteristically, what happened was, well-off farmers in the mainland were looking for extra land, really good land for fattening, so they became out farms, and they were farmers. They weren't entrepreneurs. You know, it would have made a wonderful holiday village. You know. But, and you can drive onto the island, you know, because there's a bridge there now. It's not that far away, yeah. Where it is. Oh, I will, absolutely.
Yeah, it sounds fascinating.
Yeah.
But it's interesting because the initiative itself, going back to 1918, 1919, after the First World War, obviously is done for the best of reasons.
It was very well meant.
And some aspects of it well organised.
That's right.
But one or two key things just weren't.
That's
like
right.
the absence of a bridge.
That's right.
And
yeah, the isolation.
And James Craig, or Lord Craigavon, the Prime Minister of Northern Ireland, went and visited him in the early 1920s, didn't he?
1932, I think.
Right, okay.
He came along on a boat, and but they were really petitioning for a bridge, but he just ordered an upgrade of the ferry. It was refurbished at that time. And at one point, you know, in some official documents, these would be like civil servants, there was a letter which referred to them as men of their class, you know, and they were seen as lacking in initiative, you know.
Okay, that's not very good.
Yeah.
These were guys who had been, had arms blown off and whatever else in the First World War, traumatised bad, and came back to a land fit for heroes.
Complete different culture there, different understanding. And Basil Brooke and the Cahir Healy, the nationalist MP, they sort of spoke out on their behalf as well. But, you know, we had a wider look. We had a look at all those schemes that were rolled out you know, in all big Commonwealth countries, none of them worked out apart from Canada. Australia, the same things, people traumatised, isolation. In Canada, they did it on a huge scale, but they were used to immigrants and they were used to helping them to integrate, and even the Women's Institute, which started off in Canada, I think, or was brought to Canada, I think it started off in Canada. They got wives and showed them how to bake and sew, and it's the one place where it was really quite successful. But characteristically in other parts of the world, I was over at Kew at one time, found myself looking for records and found myself beside a New Zealand woman who was doing something quite similar. And I think she had written about it, but that was the case as well. So in the islands of Scotland, the Highlands and Islands, they had schemes, but they weren't well thought out. The more, of course, these were I'm talking about now the farms. You see, the Homes for Heroes thing. There were three categories. You could get a house. You could get a house with a plot of land, or you could get a farm, a holding. The farm holdings, first of all, it started off, but they found it real difficult to get land. So that it kind of petered out. But those were farm holdings I'm talking about in those other places. That didn't work out very well, apart from in Canada. But places like Craiga, all around there, where they have got Somme Drive and Feetville Avenue and all this sort of thing, that was ex-servicemen's housing.
You know them well.
Yeah. Yeah, my granny lived in Merrick Gardens.
You know it well, yeah.
Do you? George Best country.
I did,
Yeah.
I lived just above it for a time.
Did you? Yeah. And there were big Welland Garden City and all those what do you call it? Huge place outside London. And they built those, and they were built with a certain amount of idealism, because the idea was to help people to be self-sufficient after all the shortages of the war. And also that they would be within distance of possible employment, rather than being in the middle of nowhere. There was a huge one built outside Colester, outside Dublin and Colester, but they went down a different route, and there were problems in the south. You see, ex-servicemen were just not the flavour of the month.
Wait, and you were saying about some of the folks here when you started the project weren't sure about being involved because they were from a nationalist background.
Yes, yeah,
So
yes.
after 1918 it was...
Yes, but that was writ large in the south. And actually, the people in Colester went on a rent strike, and it meant that the Irish Sailors and Soldiers Land Trust weren't getting any income, so they couldn't repair the houses or anything. But that scheme carried on. You know, here, John had a cousin, Wendy Gunning, who lived in Cabin Hill Mews.
Oh, yeah.
You remember where that is?
Yeah.
She was in the civil service, and she, the thing was scaled down, but it was kept on as some, I can't remember what the organisation was, until maybe the 1970s or maybe 80s. And she'd have people coming in. But anyway.
It's interesting what you're saying, because I hadn't thought about it before. The initiatives in the south that would have been started after 1918, before partition, then weren't necessarily kept up in the same way as other parts.
They were outside Sligo, outside Galway, outside Cork. All of them had these.
I hadn't thought of that. I'll have to look into that.
Yeah, it was an all Ireland. It was the Irish Soldiers and Sailors Land Trust. Right. And that was set up after partition, and it was administered jointly, London, Belfast and Dublin. So that was your first cross-border body, I would say. And the money all came from London. The money all came from London.
Yeah. Yeah, and I suppose the rationale for that is in terms of those folk serving.
They had served the country.
During the war.
That's right, yeah.
Any cost associated with that.
Yeah.
back to that government.
Yeah.
Okay, it's really interesting. Actually, I'll go and look that
Oh.
up.
I'm sorry I haven't got a copy of the book to show you or give you.
Marion, that's been superb. It
Oh,
really
no,
has.
not at all. There are copies of the book in my brother's shop. But if you watch the film,
Yeah, they.
Making It Home, that'll tell you the guts of it.
Yeah, I will do.
Yeah. So,
Excellent. Marion, thank you very much indeed.
Not at all.
Absolutely super, and I'm sorry.
well, you
I've
know
taken
where I
up so
am.
long
If you
of your
no,
time,
not
so much
sure.
of your
You know
time.
me. When I get started, I don't stop either. So,
I'm gonna stop this now. Hold on to that.
okay. Oh, my grandfather had a bicycle wedding.
You're going to tell me something interesting now after I've stopped?
No, no.